I talked to Charles Freeman. He's a former assistant US trade representative for China Affairs. I began by asking about the bank's decision to conduct its transactions in dollars rather than China's increasingly used renminbi currency.
I think the plan has been to eventually wean itself of complete reliance on dollar investment and move to both renminbi and perhaps Japanese yen investment. I think the reality is right now it's got a lot of dollars, so why not use what it has?
And would that make project financing more expensive to start?
It certainly could, and I think as they go through and look at the different criteria of loans that they're reviewing, I think that will come as a bit of a shock to the system and how expensive it actually will be to lend in dollars.
The president of this bank was in India just before the launch. We've heard countries like Indonesia being mentioned, Bangladesh as places where this investment money might go. Are these the countries we should be looking at to see where these AIIB projects start popping up?
I think there's a long queue, and Bangladesh and Indonesia have jumped to the front of that queue. Whether or not that's actually where the investment goes at first is another question. No one is sure exactly what projects are, whether they're really bankable, whether these are purely political plays by the host governments or whether these are something that AIIB wants to invest in.
Is it obvious that countries like Bangladesh that need infrastructure are the ones that are ripest for this kind of thing?
You would think so, but Bangladesh has reached out to the international development community for years with some of these projects, and some of them haven't made sense from either an investment or a governance standpoint. It'll be a real test of the AIIB to look at these and say, do these actually make sense for us and for our criteria going forward?
Typically, when we see countries enter a period of slowdown, infrastructure projects are the first things to go. China is slowing down a little bit. Might we expect them to rein back a little bit? In other words, is this maybe the wrong time for China to be launching this kind of institution?
Well, you could argue that there's a huge capacity for infrastructure development already in China, and when there's a need elsewhere in China, taking some of that capacity and applying it there makes some sense. Whether or not host governments will welcome Chinese construction teams and other things as much as I think the Chinese would hope is another question.
One of the things that interested me is the president said he felt it was more important at this stage to develop a corporate culture, to develop this institution, rather than the lending. Is that the right way to approach things?
I think you've got to have both. I think one of the things with the AIIB that's different from perhaps the World Bank or the ADB or others is it really is a lean group of people making decisions, whereas at the ADB you've got this board of governors that has to review every loan, and each governor adds his or her own little want as part of that. It makes the loans themselves much more cumbersome. So establishing a culture which looks at kind of quick decision-making, business-driven decision-making, I think actually makes some sense.
You mentioned lean. That's one of the buzzwords. I think the phrase that the president had come out with was lean, clean, and green. And it's really lean. I think the initial staffing is just 50 people. I was staggered to read that. The European Investment Bank, sort of a comparable size, maybe a bit bigger, has 2,000 staff. Can 50 people actually get a $100 billion bank up off the ground?
I think Chinese investment teams, generally both private sector and development banks, are very lean. That's in part because of a control issue of keeping things under control and in as few hands as possible. It's also to do with the capacity, really. There just aren't that many really strong bankers within China that can be applied to some endeavor like this. You know, whether or not 2,000 employees is the right number, I think you could probably argue that you're getting more bang for your investment buck if you invest through the AIIB than the EBRD, for example.
The bank has said that there's no obligation for its partners to adopt the kind of free market policies that institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund would adopt. And yet at the same time, it's talking about having governance, about being right on top of this kind of thing and transparency. Are the two compatible?
It's a very good question. I think it remains to be seen. Clearly, the World Bank, the ADB, other institutions of its ilk, the IMF, have a particular set of blueprints for how they like to see the countries that they lend to follow. China has said that's not necessary. It will be interesting. I mean, clearly, some of the governance decisions or the governance questions that are raised in the context of ADB or World Bank lending probably don't add a lot to the basic tools of development. So in some aspects, it's refreshing that the AIIB doesn't have those demands. On the other hand, not having good governance as part of a loan criterion makes the process of actually recovering that investment long term somewhat more challenging. So we'll see.
But it's a fairly nimble institution. I mean, took, I think, 2 years to set up. That's impressive.
It's remarkable.
Would you expect to see this institution then move pretty quickly once lending starts, once these projects start?
I would, and the only question I have is what happens when there's a large failure, and that could happen as quickly as a large success. So that may stimulate some other thinking about how the bank wants to go forward, but we'll see.